Forward by Jeremy Clarkson, right? Turning the world into something it's familiar with.
How do we become self-actualizers?
Oh, that's a good question. Turning the world, the outer world, into something like a machine.
But as victims of social structures.
Extra-physical, metaphysical.
Welcome to Parallax Views, an IEA series of conversations about the politics of culture. I'm Marc Glendening, and today I'll be talking to Gary Lachman about his book, Caretakers of the Cosmos, which focuses on the nature of human consciousness and the changing social understanding of it. Gary's book is hugely important because it represents a rediscovery of an optimistic appreciation of what it is to be human. It suggests we can find meaning through the application of our innate natural state of freedom. So the book is about the spiritual content of freedom, not just its form. Gary deserves a very lengthy introduction, but sadly isn't going to get one now because of the constraint of time. Suffice to say, he's had a very varied and interesting career as a professional rock musician. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, former bass player for Blondie, a group I certainly was a big fan of in my teenage and later years. And he is also a philosopher, a prolific writer of books about the philosophy of the mind, the esoteric, and the spiritual. Your book, Gary, describes how human consciousness has undergone a series of transitions. Could you outline some of these?
Yeah, some of the people I talk about in Caretakers of the Cosmos and some of my other books, they seem to chart a shift from what we might say an earlier embedded kind of consciousness, where human consciousness was much more, it had a much more participatory character with the outer world, unlike our own now, where we have a very sharp distinction between our inner world and the outer, hard, physical, external world. Someone I talk about, I mentioned in Caretakers and other books, is a fellow named Owen Barfield, who was one of the Inklings. He was a friend of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, but he was also a writer in his own right, and he wrote quite a bit about the history and philosophy of language. In a very early book of his called History in English Words, he said that we can look at language as a kind of archaeology of consciousness. And if you go further back in language, history of language, not only English, but languages in general, the further back you go, the language becomes more and more metaphoric, what we would call imaginative and sort of poetic. And over time, language becomes more and more prosaic, sort of matter of fact. And this was originally thought to be, at some point in way back when, there was a generation of sort of, poets at some point in the, way back time. And they had this fantastic, time of creating all these metaphors. And then it suddenly, after that, it became, back to normal. But he's saying, actually, it wasn't the case that there was like a generation of wild poets at a very, very early time in the history of language, that the language was poetic and metaphoric and imaginative because human consciousness saw the world in that way. It saw the world in which the outer world was much more living. It was much more vital. It had a participatory character. And over time, that shifted. And so there's different thinkers. Gene Gebser is another one, said the same thing. He's not that well known. He should be better known. He's a German-Swiss philosopher who died in the early 70s, but in the 40s, he wrote a book called The Ever-Present Origin. And it's a massive text, and I can only sort of just give a surface idea of what it's about. But like Barfield, he said that human consciousness went through different stages of what he called structures. And he talks about what he calls the mythic structure of consciousness, which is much along the lines of how Barfield would understand the early stages of language, where there was a participatory character. So all the myths, all the notions of gods and elementals or spirits or that sort of thing inherent in nature were not just bad ideas, that we subsequently jettisoned. Oh, we're much smarter now. All those earlier people, they were superstitious. No, they actually saw the world in that way, and their consciousness participated with the world. And at a certain point, Gebser talks about something that the philosopher Karl Jaspers called the axial age, which is around 500 BC. There was a shift from this mythic sort of structure of consciousness into the mental, rational, which is where we've been since then, quite some time. These structures take quite some time to work themselves out. But according to Gebser, each structure reaches a certain apex. Its inherent possibilities are actualized as much as possible, and then it goes into a kind of overripe hypertrophying. And for him, for Gebser, and for others who I've talked about, this mental rational structure, what we just would consider, rational mind, conscious, everyday consciousness, has been sort of in decline in the sense that it's starting to break up. It's starting to lose its grasp on the nature of things. With any luck, Gesper suggests making the possibility for a new emergence of a new structure of consciousness, which he calls the integral.
And how does his theory relate to another writer you talk about in the book, Ian McGilchrist's idea of there being a left brain and a right brain? It seems are these two kind of approaches complementary, or are they antagonistic?
No, I did a whole book using Gebser's ideas of this notion of structures of consciousness changing over time. And McGilchrist's notion, which he presented in a fascinating book called The Master and His Emissary. And what McGilchrist does is he reboots the whole left brain, right brain sort of narrative, which had gone into sort of eclipse in the late 80s. It was very popular in the late 70s and 80s, but then real official neuroscientists got a bit, they were unhappy that the sort of left brain, right brain story had been picked up by pop psychology or New Age enthusiasts, and they thought, oh no, this has become too simplistic and too wooey, so they left it alone. And subsequent research seemed to say that although we have two different brains, each side, they seem to do the same thing. The initial idea was that they did very different things, and the cliche was that the left brain was a scientist and the right brain was an artist. And it is true, the left brain deals with language, sequential logical thought, in a way that the right brain doesn't. But what McGilchrist has done is, in rebooting this, he says it's not so much what they do, it's how they do it. The left brain and the right brain relate to the world in very, very different ways. We can say the left brain is sort of a microscope. It focuses in on very, very particular aspects of reality with the incredibly sharp clarity, but at the expense of its connection to everything else. Whereas the right brain is a kind of panoptic vision, which shows you the larger global holistic picture, but it's vague and a bit fuzzy. So you get a kind of implicit sense of a connection to everything, but you can't quite pin it down. And when you start to pin it down, you lose the connection. But on top of that, McGilchrist suggests that there's been a kind of friendly rivalry between the two sides of the brain throughout human history. And they've worked in a way that, well, much like the American system of government should work, is a series of checks and balances. So one would mitigate the excess of the other. So if the left brain was excessive in one area, whatever, the right brain would over time compensate for that. But what the left brain likes to do, because it's as Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, said, the brain is the organ of attention to life. The brain is mostly focused on how do we deal with the world, how do we survive, how do we maneuver through it. And the left brain does that best by turning the world into something it's familiar with, turning something into something it knows already. And McGilchrist suggests, since it goes back further than this, but he would say certainly since the Industrial Revolution, the left brain is very busy at turning the world, the outer world, into something like a machine, or I guess today we would say a computer or something like that. It's turning the outer world into something that it's already familiar with, and because it's much more easy to maneuver through the world, to manipulate it. But this is at the expense of the input from the right brain, which if we say the left brain takes care of business, we can say the right brain takes care of isness, which goes back to German, the German mystic Meister Eckhart, and he talks about Istigkeit, just the sheer isness of things, which the strangeness of there anything being existing at all, which is sort of the fundamental philosophical question. And that kind of mystery, or that sort of wonder, that sort of awe, is gradually being erased and reduced because the left brain is creating a world around us where there's none of that is available. We don't see anything that suggests that anymore. We see only what the left brain has sort of created around us. And this has led to a problem where, and this is why he calls his book The Master and His Emissary, because according to McGilchrist, although contemporary thought has it that the left brain is dominant and the right brain is a kind of occasionally helpful sidekick, you know, the left brain's Batman and the right brain's Robin or something like that. It's actually the other way around, where the right brain is actually the master. It's older in terms of our history. It appeared first, according to McGilchrist, and created the left brain as someone to help it maneuver through the world, to unpack the sort of global picture. So you have a vague general sense of an implicit meaning or significance of something, and then left brain's job is to, unpack it.
So it's kind of strategical. It's to help you reach existential personal objectives that have already been determined by the self.
Well, yes, you have. Put it this way: the right brain gives you the forest, the left brain gives you the individual tree, the individual branch, the individual limb on the branch, the individual leaf on the limb, on the branch, the individual cell, and it keeps going, down and down and down, but more in precision, but you lose track of the connection to everything like that. And we need it. It's absolutely essential for our survival. But as I say in this book and others, it does its job too well. It's a valet who won't let you do anything for yourself all the time, and you're increasingly surrounded by it's helping you in that sort of thing. And this is, according to McGilchrist, has created a situation in where, in a general sense, that sense of meaning that we find, say, in poetry or in art or in music or just, a spring morning or, in larger sense in mystical experiences is increasingly just sort of not part of the picture anymore. So we don't have any kind of overall sense of a meaning behind the social meanings or the utilitarian meanings that we're engaged with all the time.
And this helps to explain, you argue in the book, the sort of growth of an alienation. So there was an initial alienation when we started to perceive ourselves as being separate from nature, as being a sort of autonomous agent. The sort of stuff you write about Mount Ventoux, maybe say a bit about that. But also, then there's a sort of second wave of alienation that comes once we become fully immersed into the kind of left brain rational world, because what's the point of it all? What's the meaning of life?
This is it. Like you say, it's in the mythic structure, or prior to Jasper's axial age, we had stories, we had narratives to explain things. Things are this way because this god did this, or this happened in the past time, and all that sort of thing. But at a certain point, roughly around 500 BC, whereas in the rest of the world, you get the rise of these central, very, very important figures who kind of set the basic notion of ethical, moral, sort of spiritual standards. So you have Lao Tse, Confucius in China, you have Buddha in India, you have Zoroaster in Persia, you've got the Jewish patriarchs in the Holy Land. But in the Greek area, something different happened. This is the beginning of rational inquiry. So you have the pre-Socratic philosopher Thales of Miletus. He doesn't want to know why did the gods make things this way. He points to a rock or a cloud and says, what's that made of? Like, what's the basic stuff this is made of? So it's no longer, let me tell you why the gods did this so that things are the way they are. It's like a physical, basically, or a naturalistic explanation for things. And this begins the whole point of rational inquiry. And yes, we start to move out of this embeddedness where we feel more of a distinction between ourselves and the world around us. But there's still ties to it in some way, and the complete severance or the beginning of that, Gebser would say, starts around the Renaissance. You mentioned Mount Ventoux. He points to this account by the Italian poet Petrarch, who in the 14th century, he decides to climb a mountain just to see the view, which apparently no one else had had that idea before. Apparently, obviously people had climbed mountains before, scaled the heights, but they were pushed by, something behind them, making them do this. And suddenly it's like, I wonder what it looks like from the top of that mountain. And it's the windy mountain. It's on the Tour de France now, so people go up it all the time. But back then it was considered like, why are you doing this? And he tells a story of running into a sort of farmer or something on the way, and he tells him what he's going to go do, and he says, no, don't go there, it's only demons are up there, or whatever, you'll have a horrible time and all that. And Petrarch does, and he's amazed at the distance that he can see, the space around him. And both Gebser and Barfield say, up until then, human consciousness, at least in the West, was like part of a tapestry. We were part of a two-dimensional sort of scene. So we fit into the picture along with, nature and the church and a variety of other things like that, but it was all sort of flat. Suddenly that becomes another dimension. And this kind of space opens up that up until Petrarch apparently hadn't been noticed before, or there aren't too many accounts of anyone, talking about it. And this terrifies him. He feels exalted, he's awestruck by it, but at the same time it's like, And, not too long after that, you get Blaise Pascal, who's a good example of somebody who combines both sides. He's a logician. He invents one of the first computers, the Pascaline, because his father was a tax collector. So he invented a kind of adding machine so his father would be able to add up the taxes correctly. But he's also a deep religious thinker. And in his Pensees, which were found after his death, he has that line where the eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me. And this is the further opening up of those spaces, because by the time of Pascal, we do have Copernicus. We do have the notion of the sun and the other planets. They're no longer circling around the Earth, creating the lovely, harmony of the spheres, the music of the spheres. We find ourselves in this vast, empty, extended sort of space. And so Petrarch's awe and terror, by the time of Pascal, begins that kind of existential dread that we feel in the face of this infinite emptiness that we find ourselves in.
And so that kind of alienation has been sort of succeeded, has it not, by a new type of alienation that is the product of the idea that has emerged with the mental rational phase that Gebser talked about. The idea that human beings really are predetermined kind of machines, that the notion of that they might have a spiritual significance is, the logical positivists would say is meaningless, sort of guff. And so you then start to get a new kind of age of pessimism and sort of deterministic ideas, which in a way are kind of analogous to the kind of pre-modern ideas that the gods sort of determined everything. Yes. But now it's, I don't know if you want to say something about that.
I think that's, well, with the increasing analytical power and reach of the left brain or Gebser's mental rational structure, everything becomes exposed, everything becomes explained. We're aware of all the antecedent factors that lead up to. So, a strict determinist would say everything you and I are saying right now has been predetermined by, all the antecedent actions and thoughts, and which themselves were predetermined, and so on and so on. So we can't escape that. Whereas with religion, for all of the retrograde and dubious elements of it, at least it allowed a certain degree of free will, because we had free will so that we could exercise it in this world and choose the right path, but not coerced into doing that. We're given the chance, but that goes out the window. I mean, I said the axial age, 500 BC. I would say the early 17th century, the early 1600s is the beginning of the time when that the last vestiges, let's say, of the mythical kind of sense, the sense that we're part of some kind of narrative, some sort of story, some account of ourselves that's not an explanation, but it's a story. Because a story isn't an explanation; it's not the same thing. I would say that goes out the window, and one of the things that brings that on, and this is how in a book mine I wrote after this one called "The Secret Teachers of the Western World," where McGilchrist's ideas and Gebser's come together, is that up until early 17th century, there was a body of work and a figure associated with it, the Corpus Hermeticum, the body of Hermetic writings. And this figure, Hermes Trismegistos, thrice greatest Hermes, who up until then was actually considered a real person. He had lived way back in the earliest dawn of time, and he had influenced Moses and Plato and Jesus and everyone who came after him. And he had this primal revelation about the nature of reality and the relationship between the human and the natural world and the divine and all of that. And through, actually just by chance, during the struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism, and the Church of England is usually they try to reach a happy medium, some in between space, and a rising humanist scholar, Isaac Kasabin, was asked to write a history of the church from this point of view, trying to accommodate both the Catholic and the Protestant sort of view of things. And along the way, he discovered that this body of work, the Corpus Hermeticum, which was believed to have been written, ancient times, could not have been written at the time that it was thought to have been written, because the Greek it was written in was a much later Greek. It was the later Greek than the Greek that Plato wrote in, right? So, and also, if Plato and everyone else was so influenced by this fellow Hermes Trismegistos, why is there no mention of him in any of the Platonic texts? So, Kasabin's conclusion was that these Hermetic texts were sort of a pious lie. They were kind of propaganda written by early Christians to sort of show how this Hermetic figure and these Hermetic writings presaged the rise of Christianity. I mean, subsequent scholarship has criticized Kasabin's reading of it as well. But it was at that point that this body of writing that sort of gave the authority or the street cred to this vision of humanity as somehow having a spiritual, background and source of all that. It sort of went out the window. I mean, it was taken over by the church, but the church had its own sort of approach to this. And then you get the rise of what we call science after that. So since then, Gebser would say, and also McGilchrist would say, that's been snowballing to where we find ourselves today. We give sort of lip service to any kind of religion. Socially, we have to recognize it and all that. Mostly because of its community sort of aspect, it gives people a sense of identity. But the notion that there is some kind of extra-physical, metaphysical reality that we link to, it's our source, is that sort of went out the window. And so we find ourselves having to explain ourselves purely in physical, materialist terms.
So it seems to me you represent a very unique and rather fascinating coming together of two traditions that most people would see as being in contradiction. On the one hand, the Western, broadly liberal, rational tradition that Gebser writes about. But also, on the other hand, you are an advocate, a believer in the esoteric, and you don't see the two types of thought or as being in contradiction.
I don't think at source they necessarily are. I mentioned this in practically all the books I've written about this sort of thing. I mean, Newton, Isaac Newton, who we can consider the father of the modern world and all that, modern view of things, he wrote much more about alchemy than he did about gravity. And at the time, he was criticized for his idea about gravity because it was considered this invisible occult force. Occult just means hidden. It just means something that we can't see, or occluded. So when we have an eclipse, You know, the solar eclipse, the moon occludes the sun. We know the sun is there, we just can't see it. But we know it's there. So you could say the occult, the metaphysical, it deals with those realities that are the physical world can't accommodate. So, and you know, but the whole Platonic tradition is that. In many ways, I mean, this what we call, again, occult is, or esoteric, it's a huge umbrella term, and there's lots of things, you know, if you go into, you know, a metaphysical bookshop, it's, you know, witchcraft and flying saucers and a variety of other things like that, and they all kind of fit under this general kind of umbrella of like what's marginalized outside of the mainstream tradition. But there is a very, very, you know, clear heritage of a kind of esoteric thought, and just in the Platonic tradition. Because, you know, Plato's talking about realities that are grasped by the mind, not by the senses. Where we are now is we're only interested in realities that can be grasped by the senses, or by instruments that augment our senses, or the mathematics behind the instruments that augment our senses. But the notion that there's some kind of actual reality, not inferred or you know, supposed to be, that can be grasped by the mind alone, there's a long tradition of that. And that's what I call, in other books I've written, called the lost knowledge of the imagination. Because the imagination seems to be a faculty by which we can grasp these realities that are not immediately present. And I would say you can find in more mainstream philosophical thinkers, like Henri Bergson, the French, great French philosopher who 100 years ago was widely known and one of the most famous thinkers in the world. He's not that well known these days. But I mentioned that he said the brain is the organ of attention to life, and the intellect is the faculty through which we do that, to which we attend to life. But there's another faculty we have the intuitive sense, which again, which is something, it allows us to participate in the reality. The intellect sees at the surface. It sticks to the surface of things and the relation cause and effect, whereas the intuition allows us to enter into.
And change that reality.
Well,
so it's a sort of
I mean, yes, that's
a dialectical kind of relationship.
Well, yeah, true. I mean, well, again, it depends how far you want to go with that. I mean, can the mind by itself somehow affect outer reality? Well, there's a whole esoteric, spiritual, you know, tradition, magical tradition, that can be true. You know, whether everyone who claims that they're doing that is actually doing that's a whole other story. And that's something that I think that would, you know, warrant a whole other kind of conversation. But Gebser, Barfield, many other people that I refer to in the book, the whole idea that, you know, what happens out in the outer world, it has its roots in the beginning in the mind. So that's the whole opposite of many ways. I don't know if it's a liberal tradition, but certainly the Lockean, the John Locke tradition. Locke said, you know, there's nothing in the mind that didn't get there by way of the senses. And this is, Gebser would say, and Gilchrist would say, that's a perception coming out of the left brain, or mental rational dominance. You know, we arrive in the world tabula rasa, or as I say in some of my books, it's like we all are unfurnished flats, and we have to go to IKEA and buy a bunch of stuff, and we bring it home, then the flat's furnished. Whereas Plato would say, no, we already come equipped with some things, the ideas, the forms. And if you know the I forget which dialogue it's in, where Socrates shows that the untutored slave inherently knows these essentials of mathematics and things of that sort just through a process of questioning. A more contemporary thinker who talks about, you know, an inner kind of furnishing would be Jung, Carl Jung, with his notions of the archetypes. So rather than coming into the world a blank slate and we're empty until we, you know, things in the outer world impress themselves on our inner mind, Jung, Kant, others would say you wouldn't have a perception of the outer world unless you had these categories or archetypes or whatever it is that allows us to have the experience in the first place. So, and I would say that is part of this esoteric tradition, that we're not born empty. We don't come into the world naked, even though physically we do, but not in the sense of our interior. And you can find, you know, others as well. Husserl, Edmund Husserl, who's the founding father of the phenomenological tradition in Western philosophy, out of which existentialism came, hermeneutics and all that, he too believed that consciousness is intentional. There's always consciousness of something. It isn't a blank slate. And on top of that, consciousness reaches out into the world. So the Cartesian view is that, even though Descartes would say, well, yeah, we do have some inherent ideas. He allowed for some inherent ideas. But most of it is that, the mind is like a mirror. And there's an already fully formed outer world, and we merely reflect that. But Husserl, William James, other would say, actually, no, there's something in the mind that reaches out and forms what we consider the outer world, gives it shape and contour and all of that. And it's through that we have the experience in the first place. So it's very, very, which came first? That's kind of, it's kind of chicken and egg sort of way of looking at it. But, that, in one sense, in very basic sense, I would say is something that's shared broadly by the existential, phenomenological kind of tradition in philosophy and this kind of esoteric. Because Paul Ricoeur, who's a French philosopher, who's a very good interpreter of Husserl, and again, I can only give a quick sketch of this. He said if we really understand Husserl's notion of intentionality, just simple perception, we would recognize it as a creative act. So rather than our minds passively reflecting what's out there already, on an unconscious level, involuntarily, we were out there forming the world. And a writer who I've been influenced by a great deal, Colin Wilson, who died 10 years ago now, he took up Husserl's ideas and he developed what he called a positive existentialism to kind of counteract the rather pessimistic views of Heidegger and Sartre and Camus. But he says we have perceptions, but there's also a will to perceive. But we're not consciously aware of that will. So there's some, at an unconscious level, something in our minds is reaching out to the world and giving it the shape, giving the picture back to us. And in mystical moments or poetic moments or aesthetic moments, or there's moments when you're suddenly surprised, or after having a glass of wine, suddenly something that was absolutely boring suddenly looks much more interesting. And they would say somehow you're intending more in some way.
So you're investing meaning in objects in the external world.
You're investing in interest that will reveal the meaning that's already there, rather than projecting the meaning onto it, which would be, oh yes, that's illusory. That's yes, it's not. When you see, I tell the story. I live in West Hampstead, and walking Finchley Road, and I look over to the west, and I see the sunset over Kilburn. I think, oh, that magical land over there. I know it's Kilburn High Road. I know if I ran there, I wouldn't catch the sunset, but there's a certain kind of glow over things. Now, am I projecting that? Or in a relaxed moment, am I somehow, some part of me is aware in some way I can't, explicitly explain of a kind of a muchness. This is William James. One of my favorite descriptions of mystical experience, he says, a sudden muchness revealed in everything around you. So I would say, rather than projecting the meaning, we put the interest, the attention into things, and that allows for that meaning to be revealed.
And this heightened state of awareness, is this the path to achieving a more meaningful and spiritual life? I mean, you also write about Abraham Maslow and the notion of self-actualizers. And I don't know if how do we become self-actualizers?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm working on it.
Don't want to put you on the spot about that.
No, I'm working on it. Well, I mean, Maslow was a very important American psychologist in the 20th century. He died in the early 70s as well, and he's sort of known as the father of humanistic psychology, or later transpersonal psychology. He started out as a Freudian and a behaviorist, but he got tired of studying sick people. It struck him that all of our psychology is based on illness. At least when he was, first doing his work, it's based on studying people that, are abnormal. And he wanted to know, well, what are healthy people? Like, what's our criteria for some kind of psychic health? I mean, for Freud, it's being well adjusted. That's basically adjusting to society's norms. But what if the society itself falls below, or its standard is below a kind of inherent norm? what he called to be fully human. And again, a quick sketch is that he discovered through studying the healthiest people around him that he could find, that human beings have what he calls a hierarchy of needs. And we saw very basic, we need food, drink, fundamental things in order to live. And then after that's fulfilled, a roof over your head, a home, something like that. And then once you have that, some kind of companionship, some kind of relation to another human being, or even a pet or something like that. Some sense in which, I guess love or something like that. And then the next after that is what he calls the self-esteem level, in which what we want is the good opinion of others around us, And these are all what he called deficiency needs. These are things that we lack, and without which, we're not well. But above that is what he called the need to self-actualize. And this was not a deficiency need. This wasn't something that we lack. It's something that we need to do because we want to use our powers. We want to use our creativity. We want to express our health in some way. And this was all creative sorts of acts. And he didn't mean, necessarily some tortured genius. Could be somebody collecting stamps. Or if you do something well, if you do some work well for its own sake, not for its utilitarian value. It's not good for something. It's good in itself. And this was something that he believed was true of all of us. This was a kind of inner kind of standard, inner criteria that we all shared. But towards the end of his life, he became concerned that with the question of why is it that many people don't reach that level, or they're satisfied with reaching just the self-esteem level. They're satisfied with that level, and they don't take the next step into this self-actualizing level. And it's basically having a creative life. And again, it would necessitate the kind of notion of free will that we've been talking about,
Yes,
earlier.
because unless you have free will, you can't, the decisions you make have no meaning. I mean, if it's literally the case that this conversation is completely predetermined by some factor we can't identify, then this isn't really a meaningful conversation. We're like kind of robots. I mean, you wrote a book about Colin Wilson, which was called
Beyond the Robot.
Beyond the Robot, yeah.
Well, this is why it's tangential, but people like Daniel Dennett, the philosopher who he wrote a book years ago now called Explaining, or Consciousness Explained. And he basically argues that, consciousness is an illusion. And we really all are kind of like zombie robots. Our brain somehow creates this illusion of consciousness. And I just wonder, who does he want to tell that to? I mean, who if that's the case, who are you talking to?
I wonder if he says that to his close relatives, his nearest and dearest, his children.
Exactly,
nothing but a pre-programmed robot, to me.
Yeah, exactly, But I mean, Maslow would say we have an inherent, he wouldn't necessarily say spiritual, because he came out of a liberal humanist tradition himself, and he grew up not particularly having a good relationship to religion, per se, but he did feel that we have an inherent appetite for what we call these meta-values. So, beauty, justice, truth, idealism, all that sort of thing, that were increasingly, during his time and also now, are being explained away by other things, selfish genes or social factors or something like that. So the idea that, how should we say it, there's some inexplicable source of these kinds of things coming out of ourselves seems to be something that we just want to get rid of. We don't like that idea. And I can understand it, because it puts a great deal of responsibility on us then. Because if all of our actions are determined by something else, and it's like, I'm off the hook. I don't have to worry about anything, because the X made me do it.
Yeah, I mean, this I think connects very much to the current cultural, political climate in which a lot of people seem to want to define themselves not as kind of free, positive agents, but as victims of social structures, even if those social structures can't actually be identified. It's a bit the kind of Harry and Meghan kind of discourse that they're somehow being oppressed psychologically, and therefore they're not really seeing themselves as responsible agents. But this seems to be much more prevalent now, and particularly with kind of postmodernism, which says, we're all socially constructed by not necessarily genetic factors, biological factors, as with the sort of scientific people, determinists you were talking about earlier, but by kind of just narratives, dominant narratives that are out there. So there's this whole attempt to really escape being an individual, it seems to me now.
Oh, I think that's
and then
true.
being frightened of ideas. I mean, that's one of the things.
I think it goes back to this notion of responsibility. We want that burden. We don't want that burden. And well, I mean, in a tweet a while ago, I forget the exact context, but I wrote, "The history today is written by the whiners."
Certainly true.
Rather than the winners, you know. So history is written by the winners. So it's like it's being rewritten, and it's kind of a victim sensibility. Somehow, I am the subject of a variety of forms of oppression, and whatever dominance from these other factors. I'm not responsible for my own actions and that kind of thing. And I don't know. That may have had its roots in an understandable and necessary and warranted, examination of a variety of factors impinging on people's lives and, making it difficult for them and all that. And we all know, we don't come into the world perfectly in some perfect situation in which, oh yes, I can go self-actualize. Obviously, we have to deal with lots of pressures and constraints and all that. But it seems that it's gone from, that explains everything. And also that leads to sort of what group of oppressed people do you belong to? So there's a certain identity. You're the oppressed or the oppressors. And I mean, mea culpa, but all I hear now in recent times is someone like myself, a white male of a certain age, is I'm somehow implicitly, if not explicitly, responsible in some way for a variety.
Even if you've empirically done nothing.
I've done
to
nothing at all, because you happen to be this in this end. This is avoiding. Well, what about my own individual life? I'm no saint, obviously. None of us are, but many of us who are aware and conscious, we have tried to live in a certain way that would, mitigate any negative influences on others and all that. But no, that's fine, that's wonderful. But actually, whether you want to or not, it's in a way it's kind of Kafkaesque. You're find yourself in this world where you're suddenly faced with guilt and responsibility for something that you have no idea exactly what it is, and people aren't able to, either they aren't able to or they won't explain it to you in any other way. And there's a general sort of diffuse sense of you're somehow guilty for something, and you should feel bad about that.
So it's kind of taking us back in a way to a pre-modern period where individuals were seen as the kind of bearers of roles that had been determined for them by various forces. I mean, there's a very interesting quote towards the end of your book, which I find very inspiring, but it also connects, I think, to what is going on at the moment. You write, "Spirit can never be an object. Spirit as spirit is always an I, always a person. Personality is the most mysterious thing in creation. We know this intuitively, and it is why we find it wrong to treat others as things." But it seems to me we're now beginning to treat others as things, and we're objectifying people as being sort of avatars for entire groups responsible for oppression, structures of oppression. So we're not really looking at other people now primarily as people who have an equal value to ourselves. I mean, that's the danger, isn't it?
No, I said it's this whole notion of a group. You belong to a particular group, whether you say you do or not. Because whatever.
Yes, that's kind of imposed upon you.
Yeah, we can see that, and I forget the context. It was on the news. Someone said, and it just because I was doing something else, but it stood out yes, it all depends on what identity group you belong to. Why? So I don't feel I belong to any particular identity group. I mean, one of obviously I said I'm a white male of a certain age. I have a certain background. I live in a certain way. I have a certain income and all that. But in the context of all that, I'm me. Whatever that might mean. I might not be completely aware of all the factors that lead to my having the personality that I have, but then I can make that inquiry. I can look into that. But also, there's no way I can prove this, but I have to reserve the recognition or somehow the intuitive knowledge that bottom line, I have agency, I'm an individual, I can make choices. And I think postmodernists, I mean, this is one of the things, I mean, if I read it correctly, Foucault was very happy when he jettisoned the whole Sartrean idea of all this heavy responsibility, you know, the individual, you're free to make your own choices, and this, you know, heavy burden was on you to have that. But then suddenly he's like, oh no, you're not free. None of us are free. We have these power structures over us determining whether it's society, whether it's language and all of that. So, whew, all that burden's gone now. I don't have to worry about my choices anymore in that sense. And in any case, those choices don't make much difference, do they? They don't amount to a great deal of influence in the world. You know, we may have the illusion that we're making decisions, but actually decisions are being made by these larger forces around us. And so, it's a great relief. You know, and similarly, I think it's we have this notion of the good enough human, which I understand. Life's pretty tough, you know, it's not easy and all that, and we're not perfect. But there's an idea that, okay, well, yes, let's lower the goalposts, let's lower the standards, we can meet those standards. And I think behind that there's a kind of often unspoken ressentiment against anyone who wants to question that, you know, we can be better than we are, we can be more than we are. And this was something that Maslow talked about, and he said when he felt late in life that he didn't understand. Well, he came to the conclusion that there's something that he calls the Jonah complex. We have a fear of failure, but we also have a fear of success. We have a fear of standing out from the crowd. And Jonah, you know, was the figure in the Bible who tried to escape his destiny. He was destined to be a prophet, but no, I don't want that job. And he ran away and all that, but, you know, God eventually found him, and he had to face it. And Maslow says, he tells a story of when he was teaching, maybe at Brandeis, I forget which university he was at, and he says to his class, you know, who among you feels you're going to, you know, excel in your field? Who among you feels you're going to be great and, you know, do good work and all that? And nobody did anything. They were all rather diffident. And he said, well, if not you, who? Somebody in the other class? Or, you know, who is going to, why do you feel that it won't be you? And you could say that's just being, you know, kind of, you know, humble and modest and all that. But there was a certain fear of not wanting to embrace the responsibilities and the obligations that would come with trying to actualize that excellence in you, that greatness and something like that. So I think, I mean, I say in one of my books, you know, the figures say, like, oh, just take like the Sherlock Holmes figure, okay, the original Conan Doyle figure. He's brilliant, he's a genius, he's eccentric, he's exceptional, but, you know, but everyone goes to him and they really have a problem and they need some help. But, you know, the way he's presented in more recent times with yes. Benedict, he's yeah. autistic. You know, you have to present exceptional human beings in some way in which they're flawed, or that program, oh God, I can't remember the name of it now. The one about the young nuclear scientists in California, the Big Bang Theory. So you have one character who's brilliant, you know, he knows everything, but he's troubled. They're always troubled. But they're shown that somehow he can't tie his shoelaces or something like that. Yeah, yeah. So we have to minimize these characters all the time and make them human. And make them human means make them flawed. And we all know humans are flawed and all that, but I think we tend to focus on the flaws these days more than on, you know, anything that may show evidence of or actualizing a higher potential.
Gary, it's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you for giving me your time.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And thank you for watching.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.